Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel Kalanati. Today I'm going to embark on wrapping up 26 books. 22 of these were the ones I read for the A to Z readathon in May, and the other 4 are just miscellaneous things that I have read in May that didn't count towards that, and some things I read in June. So, because this would be a very long video, I'm going to try doing it in 5 book wrap-ups. So this video is going to be letters A through E for the A to Z readathon. The first one I read was Agents of Dreamland by Kiernan. This is one of the Tor.com novellas, and it had kind of been on my radar, but it didn't make it to my most anticipated novellas of the year list. And I really should have added it on that list because I randomly found it at the library and I thought, well, it's about time I read something by Kiernan. And it turned out it was really good. It was very X-Files. So the story takes place immediately after a cult leader in Texas has infected his teenage acolytes with an alien fungus. They've pretty much all died, and we have some agents from an agency they call Dreamland who are investigating this. One of them is a man who was there in Texas, and the other one is a woman named Immaculata, who I think is the most interesting person in this novella, so I'm going to talk about her perspective on this. Immaculata probably isn't human, and she seems to experience the past, the present, and the future kind of at the same time. So she's technically looking into this one event in Texas, but at the same time, she's experiencing another like UFO alien being thing that happened decades before, and like flashing forward to the future about what's gonna happen now that this alien fungus is on Earth and people have kind of made first contact, and it's not a cheerful view of the future. About the only negative thing I could say about this is that I wish there had been more about Immaculata, and I wanted to know where she came from, how she ended up doing this, and really more of what happens next. Despite that, I think this story stands pretty well on its own. It's not a novella that screams, should have been a novel, but it just has so much potential for more storytelling. So if there's any more that Kiernan writes, maybe another novella in this world, I would gladly read it. For B, I read Busman's Honeymoon by Dorothy L. Sayers, which is the last of the original Lord Peter Wimsey mystery novels. I still have 2 short story collections to read that I probably will get around to eventually, but I don't intend to read any of the other continuing novels that were completed after Sayers' death or with the approval of her estate or anything. I don't really need to read those. Busman's Honeymoon, as the title suggests, takes place right after Lord Peter and Harriet Vane have gotten married, and they are going to spend their honeymoon at this house in the neighborhood that Harriet grew up in. She's basically asked Lord Peter to buy the house because she always wanted to live in it. And when they show up, the owner, who had been in contact with them, isn't there to greet them, hasn't made any arrangements for them, hasn't left the keys or anything. They finally get into the house, and as you might expect, they find a dead body. As with the last couple of Lord Peter mysteries, the last in the series, this is not really about the mysteries. The murder mystery is secondary to what the story is really about, which is the romance and the relationship between Harriet and Lord Peter. Which is completely fine with me because I think both of them are fascinating people, and I think Lord Peter is one of the best detectives I've ever read in mystery fiction. Just a really human detective with strengths and weaknesses, and not necessarily afraid to show his weaknesses to the people that matter to him. So I ended up really liking this book. I think it was a good note to end the series on. Whether Sayers intended it to be the end of the series or not, I'm not really sure, but I enjoyed it. I definitely think that Sayers has humanized her characters and her detective in the series far more than any of the other like golden age of detective fiction authors have, like Agatha Christie or whatever. Lord Peter is so much more of a person and an enjoyable person to get to know than the more cold people like Poirot or Sherlock Holmes, which I enjoy both of those, but Lord Peter is a person and I like him. For C, I read City by Clifford D. Simak, which I've been saying for a little while I was going to read. So what I didn't know going into City, I hadn't really paid attention to, is that this is a fix-up novel, which means it was originally published as individual stories that were then later brought together, pieced together with a framework and published as a novel. So each chapter really is a story unto itself. What I liked about this is the framework. The idea is that humanity has left Earth, they've been gone for thousands of years, and they elevated dogs to intelligence and gave them the ability to speak before they left. So dogs have inherited the Earth, they have their own civilization, and at this point they are not really sure that they believe humans really existed. So the stories in here are set at the time that humanity was winding down civilization on Earth and heading off to transform themselves into beings that could exist on Jupiter. And each chapter is preceded by a note from like dog philosophers and scientists talking about whether the story is in fact a myth or fact. I really enjoyed that framework because in some ways it read a bit of a parody of academic work and such. I just thought the tone of it was like pitch perfect if you read it as a parody. On the whole, however, the stories were okay. I went into this with really high expectations because so many people had recommended it to me after I enjoyed Waystation by Simak, and this does some things that I don't really enjoy in science fiction, and especially in older science fiction, that Simak did not do in Waystation. The number one thing is that it's old science fiction, it's completely masculine, and there are basically no female characters worth noting in any way. It's really glaringly obvious. However, going on in great detail about why this annoys me and why old science fiction is mainly male characters, it's kind of like describing why water is wet, to be honest. So I'm not going to go into that, it's just sort of a given. The other thing, which is what far more influenced my opinion on this book than the lack of female characters, was how obviously wrong and dated and unworkable the science and technology and just drift of history was. I am a person who reads science fiction for the science, for the technology, and it's difficult for me to really get into something when I know it's just flat out wrong or kind of ridiculous. Primarily the death of cities, which is a really fundamental idea here, that humanity has invented some technologies and such which allows them to spread out. You know, one person or a family can live on acres and acres of land, and people don't want to live in cities anymore, so they're abandoning cities, and then this eventually leads to humanity going off into the solar system and changing themselves and abandoning Earth altogether. And I just find it ridiculous that this book presents people as pretty much solitary, wanting to be away from each other, when humans are like social animals, and the concept of the city has been integral to human civilization for thousands of years. That's just not gonna go away. I thought that was so strange. However, it makes sense when you know that Simak wrote it, because I think he wrote very pastoral, agrarian science fiction. That is so interesting because we are used to thinking of cities as industrial centers, centers of science and technology where things happen and where progress happens. But in Simak's world here, that's not the case. It's almost flipped, like people want to escape that. So I like the tone, I like the style, I think that Simak's ideas are interesting, but fundamentally I just couldn't switch off that part of my brain that was screaming, this makes no sense, this would never have happened, what? Anyway, I am really glad that I read it. I will certainly continue to read more by Simak, but I am just a little bit disappointed that it wasn't as amazing as I hoped it was. D is for Death's End by Liu Cixin, translated from Chinese by Ken Liu. This is the last book in the Remembrances of Earth's Past series. Did I finally get the series title right? Probably not, but let's just pretend that I did. The first book in the series is The Three-Body Problem, which many people are familiar with, at least passingly. So the series in general is about how an alien species is coming to invade Earth and take it away from humans, and humanity has a couple hundred years to try to avert this, to fight back, create defenses, or go somewhere else. There are multiple options, and the series explores pretty much all of them. This last book in the series takes everything to the extreme. I think I've said before that this is a series that explores scientific concepts on an extremely large scale and is not concerned with the micro scale at all. It is not concerned with history on an individual level. The characters do not have agency and really their own motivations. They exist to be pushed around by the plot so that ideas can be explored. And that's what makes this series great and so cool to read, because Liu Cixin has taken very theoretical concepts from today and said, hey, what if this is real? How would that play out in the history of the universe? Because literally Death's End takes you to the end of the universe. I hated all the characters from the previous book, The Dark Forest, and I thought I would really get into the main character of The Death's End because she's a woman and she's a pretty complex person, except that she fails. It's like her role in the story is to fail at everything, to make the wrong decision every time. And there's a bit near the end of the book where it says she realized she was dead inside. Like, this woman is empty and dead inside by the end. This is so disappointing to realize that you've gone through hundreds of years of time and your main character is a failure and just dead inside. And the other thing is that when we go to the end of the universe, what I feel like this series is really saying is ultimately humanity doesn't matter. We're just this tiny blip in the universe. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody really cares. There's not going to be another species that swoops in and saves us. They're much, much, much more likely to come in and just kill us. And at the end, everything that humanity has ever done, all the failures, all the successes, they don't mean anything. They ultimately have no real effect on the universe, which I think is realistic, but not something that's fun to contemplate. So I am glad I finished the series. I wanted to push through and experience the entire story, and I think that for the ideas alone, it is worth reading, but it's going to be a real struggle for anybody to get through if you read stories for characters, I think. So I'm done with it. I will read more by Liu Cixin in the future. I think he has a new book called Ball Lightning coming out, and I will probably read it if I can get my hands on it. The last book for this wrap-up is The Epigenetics Revolution by Nessa Carey. This is a really interesting nonfiction book about epigenetics, which is the study of how organisms change based on modifications to gene expression rather than modifications to the genes themselves. It's also kind of the study of how traits can be inherited that are not because of gene modification. So I think the idea today is that epigenetics have to be traits that are inheritable even if they're not changes to genes themselves, but there's some wiggle room there. I'm not completely up on the definition and what's included and what's not here. This is a pretty advanced genetics book. Somebody recommended this to me last year when I read The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and I asked, I think, for recommendations of books about genetics that were at a more advanced level because I'm pretty familiar at this point with the basics of genetics. And so this book by Nessa Carey was exactly what I was looking for. It is very technical. I think Carey does a really good job at making this material as approachable as is humanly possible for a lay audience, but there's no getting around the fact that at this point when you're this in-depth on how genetics and epigenetics actually work, you can't avoid the technical details. So in some places reading this book was like reading a textbook, like a maybe graduate level textbook. And I ate it up. I don't pretend to know everything this book says. I don't think that I have absorbed even a half of what Carey is talking about and how the processes actually work, but it was fascinating. The key takeaway from this book, I think probably the one thing that everybody should know from this book, is that the epigenetics revolution, the paradigm shift, is that scientists are realizing that what we call junk DNA in the human genome isn't actually junk DNA. You've probably heard that when the human genome was finally sequenced, that people were really surprised that about 98% of the human genome didn't do anything. That apparently is not true. About 2% of the human genome codes for proteins, which is what scientists have been focusing on because proteins, amino acids, are the building blocks of life, and if something doesn't code for a protein, then they're like, it doesn't mean anything. However, it turns out that all that junk DNA actually does code for other things, which are probably really, really important to epigenetics and how genes are actually expressed. I am fascinated by this idea. It is so cool. I mean, I think it just blew my mind. I sat there thinking about it for quite a while. I don't recommend starting with this book first if you are new to genetics. It's just too advanced. If you want to read more about genetics though, I would totally recommend The Gene by Mukherjee because it covers the basics of how genetics works and the history of genetics, which is fascinating. That is it for letters A through E that I read for the A to Z readathon in May. If you have read any of these books and you want to talk about them, please comment down below because I would love to hear from you. Also, if you have any recommendations on more books about genetics that I should read, let me know. I'll be back in a couple of days probably to tell you about the next batch of books that I read for the readathon, and until then, bye.